Hello, welcome to Mary's Pence Illuminating Conversations, a series of monthly online conversations about topics that are at the core of our work at Mary's Pence to help women and their communities flourish in dignity, justice, and solidarity. For this episode, we are sharing a recording from our October 14th, 2021 Illuminating Conversations gathering with special guest Aviva Chomsky. Avi is the author of several books, including Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal, and Linked Labor Histories, New England, Colombia, and the Making of a Global Working Class. For our conversation, Avi spoke about her book, Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration. In this book, Avi uncovers the history of Central America starting from the Spanish conquest to the events of today, including the long struggles against inequality and oppression, intertwined with U.S. policies and the impact of those policies on the region. In this recording, our Illuminating Conversation series, you will hear Avi talk about her work of examining how our memory of history can often be forgotten or suppressed, even though those same events serve as the roots of present-day challenges related to climate change, immigration, politics, and violence. There's a lot to consider and discuss, so let's jump right in for our first episode of Illuminating Conversations with Mary's Pence.
Well, it's 7:04, so let's get started. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this call. I want to introduce myself first. My name is Sarah Mechtenberg, and I am the Development and Communications Manager at Mary's Pence. And I am really excited that you all are joining us for this call tonight with Avi Chomsky to talk about her book, which I hope you all read. But if you didn't read, we're really excited that she will be talking a lot about the book at the very beginning of the conversation. Catherine will do a Q&A with her, and then we'll break out into small breakout groups so that we can have a little bit more of an opportunity to talk to one another. And then we'll come back to the bigger group to share some of our thoughts and questions. And I do want to mention, Avi, on your book, it says Aviva Chomsky, and I have listened to some other podcasts where people were interviewing you and referring to you to Avi, and I thought that they were maybe incorrect. But when we met previously, you had said, yes, it's good to call you Avi. So just so that everyone knows that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Catherine Boyton, who is our Executive Director at Mary's Pence, and ask you, Catherine, to do just a bit of an introduction to Mary's Pence and maybe some of our special guests that we have from our Aspera program. And then we'll turn it over to Avi to talk about the book.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. I'm really excited by the discussion of the book and the folks that have gathered here for this conversation. So in the room, we have Mary's Pence staff people, and we have especially, we're grateful to have our Aspera staff, which works in Central America with us. So that's Hilda, Brenda, and Ava. And we're grateful also to Emmanuel, who will be translating for them or interpreting for them. We have in the room, old friends, board members, supporters, and a lot of new people. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mary's Pence for the new folks, and then we'll move into the discussion. Mary's Pence has been around for almost 35 years. We'll celebrate our 35th anniversary next year. And we were founded to provide funding for women's organizations working in their communities to create a better world for women and their lives. We currently do our work through two programs. The first program is the Mary Pence Grants Program, which provides funding across the United States to small women's organizations working in their local communities on social justice issues. We operate pretty organically, not focusing on a single issue, but responding to grantees' needs. So some of the issues they bring forward include immigration rights, worker rights, increasing civic participation, especially among immigrants and young people, and women and girls working in STEM and leadership development. So there's a whole array of issues we support. We have received recognition for our work from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and the Grants Professional Association for our best practices in grant making to particularly small and emerging organizations. Our work with our grantees isn't just about the money. We really build relationships with our grantees, and we connect with the grantees through supportive check-ins, and through webinars on topics of interest to small nonprofits. And during non-COVID years, we have held retreats where we gathered people from across the country, and that's been really meaningful to the grantees. Grace is the staff person that manages that program, and she's on the call also. The second way we support women is through our Aspera program, which is much so linked to this conversation today. So Aspera works in Mexico and Central America, including El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras. So the countries we'll be talking about or you have read about. And through this program, we work with 10 partner organizations that are local women's organizations to create women's economic autonomy and improve their well-being. One of our core principles of the Aspera program is that change happens through organized women. So Aspera deliberately partners with women's organizations that provide a voice for women in their community. We work to support and strengthen our local partner organizations in many ways through funding, coaching, accompaniment, and Aspera also focuses, as I said, on economic well-being. Aspera stands for Economic Systems Providing Equitable Resources for All, and we support the growth of women's businesses within those countries through coaching and business skills. And we help the local organizations set up a lending pool that is owned locally that supports the businesses also. And small businesses are so essential there because there's a lot of poverty there and people are dependent on the informal sector. But our approach is holistic. We also, when emotional wellness issues emerged as a clear need, as you wouldn't be surprised based on reading the book, we began to offer retreats and workshops on stress reduction and emotional wellness. During the pandemic, when food insecurity was heightened, we began to support our partners as they provided materials and education to families on family gardening. And this year, we also have a big effort on supporting the development of leadership skills among the organizations. We've started a virtual program that's year-long with weekly sessions where leaders in the organization learn communication skills and teamwork and conflict resolution. And we know that this will help strengthen the organizations. Sarah explained the agenda for today. So I would just want to say thank you to Avi for really writing the book and for joining us today. I do have to say the book was fascinating, but it was also a very difficult book to read. Because the depth and scale of violence and greed, just shows how much suffering there has been in that part of the world. And the book also demonstrated the U.S.'s role in that, which also is a difficult message. So I look forward to this conversation to explore what has happened in the world and how we go forward also. So Avi, I'm going to turn it over to you for about 10 minutes to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background and the work you've been doing and to talk about the process of writing this book.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I have to say, it's really heartening to see all together from around the country and around the world, so many people interested in Central America. I was in college and graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And that, of course, was when the Nicaraguan Revolution triumphed. And there were revolutions going on in El Salvador and Guatemala. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States in 1980. And University of Berkeley as a city and the University of California, Berkeley, of course, are very politically active places. So if you just are sort of a person there with your eyes half open, you can't help from having your consciousness raised and becoming compelled, feeling compelled by things that are going on in the world, because there's so much activism going on locally. And really, I feel like in that decade, Central America was so central to my own coming of age politically, and that process among so many people that I knew. And when I started graduate school, my undergraduate major was in Spanish and Portuguese, and I moved on to graduate school in history. And the reason I wanted to go to graduate school was that I just felt so woefully ignorant about why are all these things happening in Central America. And I went into the history program with an emphasis in Latin American history, but I quickly discovered that there were no historians of Central America at UC Berkeley. There were actually very few in the entire United States at the time, but all of the graduate students were motivated by our interest in Central America. So there were a couple of Central Americanists in other departments, anthropologist Beatriz Mans, who worked in Guatemala, and who's published a number of wonderful books that I rely on. Margarita Melville, who's a former Maryknoll nun, who also had worked in Guatemala for many years and then been expelled from the country and also left the Maryknoll order, was in the ethnic studies department. So, you know, we found each other and we found a few faculty to help us. And there was also an active faculty organization, FACRIS, the Faculty Committee for Human Rights in El Salvador, which then expanded to FACRIS CA, El Salvador and Central America. My whole graduate school cohort then went on to teach about Central America in universities around the country and to write books about it. And at this point, there's actually a huge literature on Central America, but what's actually missing is back then in the 1980s and early 1990s, there were a lot of kind of blockbuster books that put everything together and explained it to people like us who just wanted to read something and understand what was going on. Walter Lefebvre's Inevitable Revolutions, Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer's Bitter Fruit about the coup in Guatemala, popularly accessible books. And as I've been teaching my course on Central American history, I find myself going back to those books from the 80s and 90s, because despite the sort of explosion of scholarship, most of it hasn't been synthesized or made accessible in a way to an undergraduate audience or a more popular audience. Tired of teaching books that were written 30 years ago, thought somebody has to write something that brings this up to date and that synthesizes all of this new scholarship in a way that is publicly accessible. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. Another reason that I wanted to write the book is came out of my own political experience, and I have, of course, continued to be an activist all my life, but my activism in recent years has focused a lot more on immigrant rights. And there's huge Central American immigrant communities around the area where I live now, which is the North Shore of Boston, Massachusetts. I live in Salem, about 25 miles north of Boston, but there's a number of towns around. Salem also has a large immigrant population, but it's mostly from the Dominican Republic. But in several towns around us, there's very large numbers of Salvadorians, Guatemalans, Hondurans, especially in Lynn, in Chelsea, in East Boston. And I still teach my Central America course, but what I find is that, first of all, my Anglo-US white students know practically nothing. It's as if that whole history of the 1980s has just been sort of erased from everybody's memory. So things that I think everybody has to know, like the assassination of Archbishop Romero and the Iran-Contra affair. No, they've never heard of those things. It's just they don't get taught them. And my Central American students didn't know those things either. And my Central American students often said, yeah, my parents told me there was a war, but they never wanted to talk about it. And I don't really know why they had to leave. So I felt that there are these huge gaps. And to me, the connections between the events of the 1980s and today's migration are so close and so obvious. But then I was talking to a colleague who's also a Central Americanist, who's written several books on Central American history, sort of one of my cohort. And I said something to him about how I need to write a book that explains to the world why the wars of the 1980s led to the migration of today. And he looked at me and kind of rolled his eyes and said, I don't know how you're going to do that. I don't see any connection. I was like, what? You're a Central American historian and you don't see this? Okay, so I absolutely have to write the book. So yeah, that's what motivated me to write the book. And I've been really thrilled with the response. I taught the book. I taught my class on history of Central America last spring, and my students read the manuscript in PDF form, the page proofs before the book actually came out. And I really, really enjoyed teaching it and getting feedback from my students and seeing how they absorbed it. And I've also been doing a lot of talks on it and interviews and writing about it. And I've also just heard from so many people. I mentioned the book Bitter Fruit by Stephen Kinzer and Stephen Schlesinger, which is one of the books that helped me understand what was happening back in the 1980s. It was about the 1954 coup in Guatemala and the role of the United Fruit Company, and actually one of the books that inspired me to write my dissertation on the United Fruit Company. Well, after this book came out, Stephen Kinzer emailed me and said, will you come speak to my class? We're using your book. Of course I'll come speak to your class. And I got another really touching email a couple of days ago from, and if you've read the book, you may remember this incident, but towards the end of the book, I talk about international adoption. And I mentioned the case of Dominga Sik, who was a young 9-year-old girl when the army came in and massacred her village, killed everyone in her family. And she was like the lone survivor from this village of Dos Erres. And this happened in 1982, and it was one of those horrifying events that, we read about and heard about, those of us in the Solidarity movement, a really mobilizing event. So we didn't know that there was a little girl who had survived. But years later, a documentary was made about this girl because she ended up being adopted by a white family in the Midwest and being taught to just forget her past. But the documentary, Discovering Dominga, talks about how she was contacted by Guatemalan forensic investigators who were investigating the massacre and who had tracked her down and discovered that she had been there and, as a 9-year-old would actually have memories of it and could certainly talk about the village and her family. So the documentary follows her as she sort of rediscovers her own history that had been obliterated from her own memory, as she no longer spoke Spanish. She just knew nothing about, well, I got an email from her son who said that he didn't know anything about his mother's story until he read my book, and it had inspired him to uncover this whole part of his own history. So I've just been really moved by the response that the book has gotten, and I'm just really moved to see all of you here tonight. So,
well, we're all really
over my time.
We're all really happy to be here and be listening to you. I want to ask about a couple themes in the book. So first, you start from colonization through the wars, through after the wars, and colonization was really about taking land and resources, and the wars were about taking land and resources, but in different ways. So do you want to comment on that theme a little bit, and maybe say if there's any way for us to get out of that role or that pattern?
Yeah, so I also teach a course every semester, because it's a gen ed course, on colonialism and the making of the modern world. And after the end of the course, one of my students said to me, now, like, I never even knew about colonialism before, but now everywhere I look, I see colonialism. And anytime anybody asks a question, I just want to say the answer is colonialism. Okay, that makes it all worth it. But yeah, so I see the tangled roots of colonialism in many different ways in the relationship between the United States and Central America. There's certainly parallels in the histories of European powers colonizing indigenous peoples and developing ideologies of white supremacy, the enslavement of Africans. Those happen in both the United States and Central America. And so we have and then we also have a colonial relationship between the United States and Central America. So, the independence processes in the two areas were very different. In the United States, it was the white colonizers who fought for and gained independence and continued their colonial project, whereas in Central America, it was more of a revolution against colonialism, against Spanish colonialism, carried out not by the Spanish colonizers themselves, but by a much more diverse group of the population. And yet in Central America too, it was the Spanish descended elites who ended up in power, and a lot of their own ideologies came not only from the Spanish colonial rule, but from their growing relationship with the United States. The struggles of indigenous people for recognition, for rights, for land, there's a lot of parallels in Central America and in the United States. But Central American elites also, I would say, have had a complicated relationship with the United States because they also resent their subordination and the destruction of their countries by the United States. So there's all kinds of different strands of colonialism going through this. And of course, Latin Americans often talk about the concept of neo-colonialism, that formal independence from Spain was replaced by economic, political, and military control short of direct colonization by first Northern European powers, Britain, Germany, and by the end of the 19th century, by the United States. And of course, the United States occupied Nicaragua for several decades in the early 20th century and maintained close relationships with the coffee growing and banana growing elites. The banana companies were US companies that themselves were seen as colonizers. The United Fruit Company was known as the octopus for its political and economic control that it exerted. So the Central American countries in many ways have never been really independent. So these colonial relationships have completely formed Central America, and Central Americans have struggled against these extractive colonial relationships also over and over again. So yeah, colonialism is absolutely key.
So you brought up the US's involvement in the wars of the 80s and 90s, and I know each country really had a different experience. You want to talk a little bit about the US's involvement in that era?
Yeah, so the revolutions that really started in the post-World War II period, wow, there's so many things to talk about, but let's just go back to Guatemala and the 1944 revolution in Guatemala for a minute, and I'll try to go over it really quickly. But it was really, that was the first post-World War II revolution in the context of the Cold War, and in the context of the anti-colonial revolutions and liberation movements that were shaking the entire world after World War II. So we have civil rights movements and Black Power and American Indian movement in the United States. We have the Chicano movement. So we have domestically colonized people fighting for liberation inside the United States. We have Europe's African colonies fighting for liberation. And we have revolutionary movements in Central America taking on some of these same ideologies that, the United States supposedly fought against racism, fought against Nazism, fought for democracy. But what about the people who were colonized by Europe, by the United States? We also deserve rights and liberation and democracy. Not only Europeans deserve those things. And in many cases, because the European countries, especially France and Britain, that the United States was trying to sort of shore up as its allies in the Cold War, were very unwilling to give up their colonies. The Soviet Union and China promoted themselves as the supporters of colonized peoples and their liberation. And for many colonized peoples, capitalism was colonialism. It was almost impossible to separate those. So the idea of overturning capitalism fell very naturally with the anti-colonial struggle. And so these two Cold War sides sort of reinforced each other. That also provoked the United States to see communism everywhere. So anybody who was fighting for liberation was seen as a communist, including Martin Luther King. And increased militarization and repression by the United States, and seeking of allies, basically anybody who would join in the anti-communist fight. So align the United States often with the fascist far right in the colonies and in Central America. A lot of the struggles had to do with land. And this is the other thing that the United States, so they have this sort of two-pronged policy. One is the counterinsurgency policy. The other is, especially starting during the Kennedy years, the idea of economic development, that the United States is going to prevent revolution by bringing economic development and proving that capitalism is the best system. Now, in Central America, this meant promoting some new export industries, especially the sugar industry, the cotton industry, the cattle industry. So through the US Agency for International Development and the World Bank, the United States is pouring economic development money. The Peace Corps is really active in Central America. But this is an economic development model which really replicates the economic development model of the 19th century that relies on cheap land, cheap labor, displaces large numbers of peasants, really disdains the subsistence economy, and believes that it's kind of like the Reaganomics of Central America, that what you have to do is help corporations and eventually it'll trickle down to the poor, if you remember Ronald Reagan and his trickle-down economics. So, but instead, what happened is that all of this economic development actually provoked revolution, and many of them revolutions inspired in part by Marxist thought, by a Marxist critique of capitalism and what capitalism was doing to these countries and to poor people, to peasants and workers in these countries. So land reform and access to land was a huge demand of these revolutionary movements. And the other strand that went into the revolutionary movements was a radicalizing Catholic Church liberation theology. And the Catholic Church, too, was radicalized in this post-World War II period, in part because of its experiences in Latin America. And liberation theology had its roots in Latin America, even though the Second Vatican Council, which happens in Rome, is what sort of opens the door to allow liberation theology to emerge in Latin America. But liberation theology has a lot of affinity with Marxist thought in that it preaches that the will of God is not that the poor should just shut up and suffer. The will of God is that the poor should create social justice here on earth. So popular education projects, Christian-based communities, consciousness raising among the poor, that they are carrying out God's will by trying to bring about more social justice here on earth. So there was a lot of affinity, and those are really the two sort of ideological, intellectual strands that went into the revolutionary movements of the 1970s and 80s. now, just to say something about the differences among the three countries. So Nicaragua had been ruled by a family dynasty dictatorship that was put into place at the end of the US occupation. The US agreed to leave Nicaragua once they had created and trained a national guard and groomed Anastasio Somoza the first to take over running the country in the interests of the United States. It was really a family dictatorship, extremely corrupt and personalist, but a strong ally of the United States, and strongly promoting these anti-communist development policies that were so devastating for the poor. Nicaragua, it was a war of national liberation against US domination, against the Somoza dictatorship, and against the economic development model, and nourished very strongly by both Marxist thought and liberation theology. A missionary in Honduras said, to be a Christian is to be a revolutionary. And in Central America in the 1980s, to be a Christian was to be a revolutionary. In El Salvador, the FMLN, Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, likewise grew out of some of the same social ferment and economic development policies. El Salvador is a much smaller and more densely populated country. El Salvador is the only country that faces only the Pacific. Every other Central American country has both Atlantic and Pacific coasts, or Caribbean and Pacific coasts. And the Caribbean coast is really where US influence had been the strongest through the United Fruit Company, because that's where the banana plantations were established. So especially in Guatemala and Honduras, and also in Nicaragua, the Atlantic coasts were really almost like a state within a state, controlled by these US companies, United Fruit and a few other companies, especially in Nicaragua. So El Salvador was more urban, although it had a lot of rural areas as well, but really strong union movements and urban popular organizing. It was more industrialized than the other Central American countries. And in El Salvador, the revolutionary movement ended up controlling a significant amount of the country's territory and basically establishing its own state-like structures in the FMLN-held territories. And the city of Berkeley actually had a sister city inside the FMLN-held territory. So a lot of people from Berkeley traveled there. People from San Jose Los Flores came to Berkeley to talk about what was happening there. And the sister city movement, I mean, another piece of what's going on here is a growing solidarity movement, some of it in the United States, some of it coming out of religious denominations, and some of it coming out of the sister city movement. So many towns and cities in the United States established sister cities in Central America. And much of it also in support of refugees who were fleeing the wars. But so let me just also say one thing about Guatemala. Guatemala is much more indigenous than the other countries of Central America. The Guatemalan highlands had remained fairly independent, autonomous indigenous communities speaking indigenous languages were much more prevalent in Guatemala, in part because of the height of the mountains, where plantation agriculture just couldn't spread there. So they were lands that hadn't been taken over. But they too were afflicted by the land scarcity, the land hunger, and the spread, especially of the cotton and cattle industry, where indigenous people were forced into migrant labor and displaced from their lands. Cattle was especially important at displacing people from their lands because basically cattle can graze anywhere. You don't need like big flat areas like plantations. So in Guatemala, the right-wing response to the growing mobilization among the peasantry was in some ways the most virulent. Hundreds of thousands of people killed and displaced, hundreds of villages destroyed, and the United Nations Truth Commission that investigated after the end of the war called it a genocide against the indigenous people of Guatemala. And the Guatemalan revolutionary movement never gained, certainly not the level of success that in Nicaragua, the revolution triumphed in 1979. In El Salvador, the revolutionary movement succeeded in controlling a good part of the country's territory. In Guatemala, the revolutionary movement never really succeeded in controlling anything except a few like really remote rainforest areas, and was really unable to protect the villagers who rose up in support of the revolution. So, I mean, the history of all three countries is really tragic, but Guatemala in some ways is the most tragic. And I should also say that after the revolutionary triumph in Nicaragua, the United States, of course, is not ready to give in and creates this proxy army, the Contra Army, and spends the entire 1980s trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan revolution. So the US is deeply involved in all three countries.
Clearly, the violence and the land loss and the poverty, caused a lot of immigration, and each country was a little bit different. Do you want to talk a little bit maybe about our immigration system and how badly broken it is, and maybe what it should look like?
So in many ways, I feel like the immigration that we're seeing today is a result of the loss, the defeat of the revolutionary movements. That is, it's true that people fled the wars in the 1980s, and that's when we start seeing large-scale migration from Central America, is during the wars of the 1980s. But the numbers of people who are fleeing Central America today are fleeing the neoliberal model that was implemented under US auspices after the wars ended, after the revolutionary movements were crushed. So these are really refugees from capitalism. If anywhere in the world we're seeing refugees from capitalism, it's in Central America, where alternatives to capitalism were just demolished systematically. So the United States has very strict limits, numerical limits on immigration. Most Central Americans do not go through, and those limits make it almost impossible for a poor person from Central America to ever access the official immigration system of the United States. If you don't have specific job skills or family members who are citizens, the immigration system itself is basically closed to you. Most Central Americans are coming to the United States hoping to be granted asylum. And the asylum process is separate from the immigration process, and there's no numerical limit on the number of people who can be granted asylum in the United States. But the asylum system is also very highly politicized and broken, making it close to impossible for Central Americans to access that system as well. And if you follow the news at all, the vast majority of people who come to the border to seek asylum, which they have a legal right to do under international law, are not, that right, it does not exist in reality, because under policies implemented by Trump and continued by President Biden, they're simply not allowed to access the asylum system and to request asylum in the United States. And of course, since the 1990s, there's been this huge rise of anti-immigrant fear-mongering, and a lot of that has, by both Democratic and Republican administrations, been aimed at Central Americans.
Thank you. Last question before we go to breakouts, but in the book you talk about a visit to Nicaragua where you met with mothers of heroes and martyrs. And one member of your group asked them, "What can we do to help you?" And the response was, "We don't need your help. We need you to go back home and change your government policy so that we can carry out our own revolution here without your interference." So what are US citizens to do today? So how can people become activists around this change? Because change is still needed.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that sentiment made a lot of sense in the 1980s when there were organized, strong, coherent revolutionary movements that had political projects that the United States was preventing them from implementing. We're in a very different situation now, but I still think that a lot of the responsibility lies in the United States. So let me just mention two things. One is that if Central Americans were trying to solve their problems through revolution in the 1980s, today Central Americans are trying to solve their problems through migration. And migration is actually an incredibly effective economic development policy. And if you recall, President Biden announced with a lot of fanfare his new plan for security and prosperity in Central America, where he was going to dedicate $4 billion over 4 years to economic development in Central America. Well, just in the country of Guatemala, every single year, migrants send back $9 billion in remittances. So migration is actually a very effective economic development policy, much more effective than anything in the United States. And that goes directly to poor people in Guatemala. It doesn't go to corrupt governments and NGOs that have fancy offices and pay fancy salaries to foreigners, and to promoting economic development projects that actually harm the poor, which is where most of US economic development aid goes. So one thing that the United States could do to help Central America would be to give immigrants the right to work, give immigrants the right to come here, to raise the minimum wage. Labor reforms in the United States, immigration and labor reforms would be a very important thing. Another thing is that one of the factors that is undermining survival in Central America very, very clearly and disastrously is climate change. Who is responsible for climate change? It's the United States. And don't let them fool you by telling you that it's all about China. It's not the fault of the United States. China is a very large country with a very large population, much larger than the United States. It's not surprising that China's total emissions are higher than the total emissions of the United States. But per capita, people in the United States emit about 3 times as much as people in China do. So the United States has to stop talking about China and start talking about the United States itself. Also, if we look at historical emissions, the United States is way over half of global emissions historically. So addressing some of our own issues at home could have a really helpful impact on Central America. And not addressing those issues is going to make things much worse in Central America in the coming years.
Great, thank you.
So the Nicaraguan mother of heroes and martyrs is still correct.
Yes, that's true, just in a different way. So we have a little bit of time to hear from a couple of the groups and also to potentially ask Avi a few questions. We want to get to kind of the close of the program and things we want to share about quarter after, so about 15 minutes. And one of those things is we want to hear from Hilda, who is the team lead for our Aspera program, and we want to leave time for that. So Joe has a question. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, in our group 4, a number of us questioned why Honduras was not included in the discussion along with Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, why Honduras was omitted.
So I'm suspecting it's a time issue today because it was very present in the book. I don't know, Avi, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So yes, Honduras was included in the book. And of course, Honduras is one of the main sources of migrants to the United States right now. When I originally conceived of the book, in my middle section of the book on the revolutions of the 1980s, I did not include Honduras. I was going to include the Honduras chapter in the last section of the book on contemporary migration. And then as I was rethinking it, it's like, wait a minute, no, Honduras has to go. It has to be like a section on each of the 4 countries in the 1980s. But the thing is that Honduras did not undergo a revolution in the 1980s the way Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua did. Instead, Honduras was turned into basically the unsinkable aircraft base of the United States in the 1980s. That's where they carried out their war against Nicaragua. That's where they trained troops. That's where the country was basically turned into a big military base. So of course that had a long-term impact on Honduras. But what I really wanted to write about Honduras was the 2009 coup. And so I went back and forth as to where does Honduras belong in the book, but I ended up putting it in the 1980s section. And then, of course, also brought it up to the present. But yeah, basically tonight, I just didn't talk about Honduras because it wasn't in the question the way it was asked.
Mhm.
We have another question from Regina asking, in your opinion, what's the likelihood of article, there's a question mark, 42 being rolled back to allow more entry from the southern border?
Yeah, section 42, which is the obscure and irrelevant public health justification for not allowing people to request asylum at the border, basically just turning people back, Title 42, that's right, turning people back. And that was invoked by President Trump, and a lot of us immigrant rights activists hoped that President Biden was going to roll it back, but he didn't. So I think that the issue of immigration is almost like the issue of vaccines. It's so politicized that somebody like Biden, like, why can't he just implement a real vaccine mandate? Because it's so politicized and he feels so vulnerable from the right, even though everybody knows that's what we have to have. And it's the same thing with immigration. I think that it's just not important enough for Biden to go out on a limb and open himself up to the kind of attacks from the right that he's going to get if he looks soft on immigration. So I'm not terribly hopeful. I mean, I blame Biden, but I also blame the political climate of the country and, you know, the whole right-wing mobilization of anti-immigrant language and sentiment.
We have a question from Elizabeth asking, what are good NGOs to support or not support?
Well, I have to say that I was not aware of your organization before you invited me to come and speak, but I am really impressed with what I've heard about the work that you're doing. And I think there are a lot of organizations that are actually working to support grassroots initiatives in Central America. Oxfam is a better known kind of larger organization that has a long history of challenging traditional models of economic development and working to support sort of bottom-up grassroots poverty eradication and development in the interests of the poor. There's a local, oh yes, Witness for Peace and Rights Action, absolutely. I've traveled with both Witness for Peace and Rights Action that also take a really political view. That is, it's not just charity, it's not just about helping people, it's not about imposing an economic development model that works against the interests of the poor, but it's about politicizing understanding the political and economic roots of poverty and challenging those as we work to support movements that are struggling for social change.
Next one's from Mariana. Mariana, do you want to read or say your question? I know you've got a question to share.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Well, thank you very much for coming, Abby. We really appreciate it. And my question is about your students. How are they reacting to this colonialism issue in terms of awareness? And this comes from this thought that many people in Latin America, including Central America, don't know how this power works and how that affects their daily lives. Like they don't have the full scope of what's going on, and that is on purpose, of course. So my question is, how are your students reacting to these realities, and how could they understand better what's happening in Central America, considering that part of the population are not aware of their own situation, globally speaking?
That's a really good question. So I've been teaching this colonialism class for about 15 years. So I've had a lot of time to work on it and to sort of learn to understand where students are coming from. And, you know, one of the first things is that nobody even knows what colonialism means. And they take the class thinking they're going to learn about pilgrims. That's the only exposure they've ever had to the concept of colonialism. So I thought I'm going to get all these radical students who want to learn about colonialism. That's not what has happened at all. But over the years, I have developed ways of, and teaching is an educational process for the teacher too, because you're trying to learn, okay, where are the students coming from and how can I reach them? So that's been the big challenge in all my classes and in this class. So what are the ideas they're coming in with, and what are ways that I can open their eyes to different things that are going on? So I love the way I start the class. And so, when I finally hit on it, I've just stuck with it. But we start by reading Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which is about the coming of the British around 1900 to an Igbo village in Western Africa. And it's just a really beautiful description of life in the village and what happens when the British colonizers arrive. Everyone should read that book. And then we watch a film from Martinique called Sugarcane Alley, which is set in the 1930s, when Martinique is, of course, still a French colony, among the Black sugar workers who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, and what it's like to be colonized after several hundred years, and even after slavery itself has ended, but the colonial relationship basically maintains quasi-slave-like conditions. So, you get to see sort of autonomous village life in Africa, and then you see what happens when people are colonized and what that does. And both of those books really look at cultural and psychological impacts of colonialism, as well as economic and political. So, that kind of sets the stage and really raises a lot of the concepts in, I think, very accessible ways. But I mean, there's a huge anti-colonial literature out there that people can access.
We have another question from Elizabeth asking, how did communism become a bigger boogeyman than fascism?
Well, I think it was Truman, when he was vice president at the beginning of the Second World War, before the United States got involved, who said something along the lines of, well, if the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans. And if the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. And the main thing is we should hope that they kill as many of each other as possible, so that we can come out on top. So, I mean, I don't think the United States was ever particularly opposed to fascism. It was definitely opposed to communism, because communism was a threat to capitalism. Communism was a big threat inside the United States as well. There were communist labor movements in the United States, communist and anarchist labor movements in the early 20th century that posed a threat to the profits and functioning of US capitalism. And European capitalism. I mean, from the time of the Russian Revolution, anti-communism was a huge motivating factor in US domestic and foreign policy. So the alliance with the USSR was really, I think, an alliance of convenience. And well before, the fact that the United States was so much more interested in fighting in the Pacific and letting Nazi Germany destroy the Soviet Union, while Stalin was begging for a second front, begging them to open a second front on the European side, but the United States was, no, we just want to defend our colonies and Britain and France's colonies in the Pacific. In many ways, World War II for the United States was a colonial war. You remember, of course you remember, because if you live in this country, you've had this really impressed upon you. How did the United States get involved in World War II? Why?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. Okay, Pearl Harbor. What exactly was Pearl Harbor? It was a U.S. military base in a U.S. colony in the Pacific. It was a naval base in Hawaii, which was a U.S. colony. Hawaii didn't become a state until well after World War II. Japan attacked a U.S. colony. And I mean, where was it fought? It was fought in the World War II was fought in the Philippines. It was fought in Okinawa. So the United States, it was a colonial war in many ways. Anyway, I could go on forever about World War II, but
Good to know. Thank you for that.
Are there any more questions? John had just noted that he has yet to read this book, but has read Overthrow and other books concerning our involvement in every former Spanish colony. Interested in any comments you have about our involvement in Afghanistan?
in a single word, colonialism.
Let me ask this question about Central America. We hope in Christian circles, we do a lot of talking about immigration and the need for immigration reform and the need for better services geared to the poor and to people who need immigration and migration services. So do you have any hopes for what would make the churches or religious people more effective? Because it's not effective right now. We just had this whole hour's conversation with no mention of it.
That's a tough one. What would make the church's activism more effective? I do think that the Catholic Church in particular has been a really strong voice in favor of the rights of immigrants, and that's been really important. I think if you look back in the 1980s, the interfaith movements, like the sanctuary movement, were a really critical component of the solidarity movement in the United States and the push to change US policy in Central America. Of course, the Catholic Church has been struggling with a lot of its own issues that maybe have weakened its potential to be a really strong voice in these kinds of human rights struggles. Certainly in Boston, I think that's the case. I don't know. I don't think I have a good answer for you.
On the ground in Central America, are church people and Christians in general a force for positive change, or are they reactionaries?
Well, liberation theology was never hegemonic in Central America. There were always pro and anti-liberation theology forces within the Central American Catholic Church. And in revolutionary Nicaragua, the Cardinal Obando y Bravo was very counter-revolutionary. There were also, of course, very strong voices in favor of the rights of the poor, and being in favor of the rights of the poor turned you into a target. Not only Archbishop Romero, and not only tens of thousands of non-famous peasant Catholic activists who were killed, but the rectors of the Jesuit University in El Salvador in 1989, Bishop Juan Querati in Guatemala in 98, I believe. So, it wasn't just at the beginning of the 1980s either. But I would say the church is still divided. There's some very progressive religious figures, and I'm thinking especially in Guatemala, active in the anti-mining movements there, the indigenous land rights and anti-mining activism in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. But it's mixed.
We have time for one more question, and it's actually from Brenda, who's a member of our Aspera team, has a question she would like to ask. I think she wants to. Brenda, us?
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre
Hello,
es
everyone. My name is
Brenda
Brenda, and I work for Mary Spence in El Salvador.
Mi comentario es en
My
relación a la
comment
migración
it's
como
regarding
mujeres
immigration, especially
trabajando
as
con
a
otras
woman who
mujeres acá en El
works in Central
Salvador.
America.
Creo que desde la
Over the
apertura de la
last few months,
economía
especially
luego
after
de
the
la
pandemic,
cuarentena, hemos visto
we've seen a lot of
y
migration
escuchado mucha
to the United
migración hacia los
States.
Estados Unidos.
A lot of the women we've worked with at
Conocimiento
Esfera
de las mismas
have
familias de las mujeres que
migrated to the
trabajan con el
United States,
programa Espera,
even bringing
que han
their children
emigrado con
who
sus
may
hijos de
be
hasta 2 meses
even
de
2
edad.
months old.
Prácticamente
They're
están
basically
utilizando a sus
taking
hijos
advantage of
como
their
un pase
children
para
and
poder llegar a los
using
Estados
them
Unidos, ya que al
as a
llegar a
tool
la
to
frontera
access the United States,
les
because when they
permiten la
arrive with their
entrada.
children at the border,
Casi que
they are
libre.
allowed because they are carrying their child. There's a
Creo que
lot
hay
of
muchos
factors that
factores que
go
hacen
into
que
place when
las
making the
mujeres
decision to immigrate
y hombres tomen
for
esas
women and for
decisiones.
men.
Una de esas creo
Most
que
important
es la
one would be
económica y
the
la más
economic
importante.
system,
La
and that would
falta
include also the
de
lack
acceso a
of
un
access to formal
empleo
employment in their
formal.
own countries.
Y también
And people are also very
muchas
afraid of what can
personas
happen to them
manifiestan
because of the
que tienen
situation with
miedo a lo que
politics
pueda
in their own
pasar
countries.
políticamente en el país. Entonces,
So
por
many
esa
people
razón
think
es
it's
mejor
way better to
emigrar
just
ahora que todavía que
immigrate to
aún
the
se puede.
US while they still can.
Como mujeres que trabajamos
We as women who
por
work
el
to
empoderamiento
empower other
económico de otras
women
mujeres,
do not
creemos
believe
que
this
esa
is
no
necessarily the
es
answer to the
una
problem, and
alternativa
would
para
like to
nosotras. Y quisiéramos que
enable
estas
ways for
mujeres,
people to
hijas de
access
mujeres que ya trabajan con
formal
el programa
employment and
Espera,
resources
pudieran experimentar otra
in their own
forma
countries.
de tener acceso a una economía más estable. Pero creo que es
However, it's
una
really hard
situación
because a lot
muy
of people
complicada, ya que
have the
muchas
mindset that the
personas piensan
American
que
dream
el
will
sueño
solve all
americano
of their problems,
es
both
la solución
economic and
para todos los
political.
problemas económicos que enfrentamos y políticos también. Eso
That's
sería
it.
todo.
Thank you.
Pues, gracias por su comentario. Thank you for your commentary, but I'll answer in English. That will be easier for everyone. This was one change that Biden did make, was that families with young children have indeed been allowed to request asylum at the border. And so, you're absolutely right that there's still, in some ways, every single migration is a family separation because every migrant has family who does not come with them, and families are separated by migration. That's an inevitable part of migration. And that's one of the reasons why migration is so tragic and so painful. Even under the best of circumstances, migration is tragic and painful. My daughter lives in Japan. She went there because she got a great job there and she married her Japanese boyfriend and she has a baby. And that means I have a grandson who I can't see. There's nothing tragic about my daughter's life. She lives a great life in Japan, but it's still tragic that her little boy can't see his grandma and I can't see my grandson. So no matter how good the circumstances are, migration has tragedy built into it. However, US policies make migration much more tragic than it has to be. If the United States had open borders and people could cross back and forth freely, migration would be much less tragic, much less of a tragic decision, and much less tragic types of family separation than what it means now. So when people migrate, they're seeking an individual solution. And as you said, people want the American dream. But migration always entails sacrifice. And if most people, if they did not have to migrate, would choose not to. A few would still choose to, but most people, if they didn't feel that they had to, would not choose to.
Hilda, do you have a couple comments?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Abby, for your talking to us. And I think there is a lot to be done besides what you were thinking about migration as economic solution for the countries and also the climate change. But I think there is a lot to be done inside the countries. And I think we need also the solidarity of every one of you that are here, as if the days of the 80s, no? I think solidarity in Central America has gone very, very low. And I think the women and families and men who are there are still struggling against colonialism, neoliberalism, and all the isms you want to name. And I think they want our solidarity, and I think that's one of the things that I will convene everyone to do. And so thank you again, and let's hope that through Espera. And the other thing, just to know, to tell you, because when you mention about the NGOs that have big how do you say, offices and all that, do you think that's a trend also pushed by the American corporations or American? So because I think there is a need of grassroots having resources to do what they have to do and want to do, but there are these organizations. So can you talk in 1 minute about that, about how you feel and how can we be very convinced that there are other grassroots organizations and international as Mary Pence that we are doing our best together with the organizations there? No?
1 minute, and then we're going to wrap this up.
Okay, see, 1 minute.
I mean, if you want to see like a terrible example, look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where really rich people feel like they can make policy for the entire world because they have the money to buy the kinds of policies they want and employ a lot of high-paid people to try to remake the world in their image and take sovereignty away from countries and people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Catherine, do you have any final words? Or I think
we've had a wonderful discussion. I'm so excited with all the engagement on the topic, and I think it's a very important topic. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you to mention the upcoming Illuminating Conversations.
Thank you so much. I told one of the people in the private chat, I feel like I could sit here and listen the next 2 hours because there's so much to talk about. And if you didn't have the chance to read this book, I really encourage you to purchase it and read it. So just 2 quick announcements. We do have our next Illuminating Conversations will be on Thursday, November 11th. And we're going to be talking about the book When My Brother Was an Aztec. And we're going to have our special guest that evening will be Cecilia Rose Lapointe, who is the executive director of Native Justice Coalition, which is a current grantee of Mary's Pence. And then on Thursday, December 9th, we'll be reading Justice Makes a Difference with Dr. Artika Tyner, who is with Planting People Growing Justice in St. Paul, Minnesota, another Mary's Pence grantee. That is a children's book, so feel free to bring your children. I'll have my son will join for a little bit. We'll discuss that book with her on that night. And thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. We appreciate your presence.
And that brings our Illuminating Conversations episode to a close. On behalf of everyone at Mary's Pence, we want to especially thank Avi Chomsky for sharing her time and insights with all of us. We also want to thank everyone who joined us live for this recording. For more information about our Illuminating Conversations series, please visit our website at www.maryspence.org. There, you can sign up to receive automated emails about upcoming live discussions, as well as notices about audio recordings of Illuminating Conversations. Whether you join us live on the second Thursday of the month, or you listen to the audio recording following the event, I hope the conversations shed new light and understanding on issues of injustice and give you a sense of how we can collectively contribute to dignity, justice, and solidarity for our communities.